Non-Muslims in Malaysia support Israel. Non-Muslims in Malaysia do not support Palestine. Now, is any of these statements true? This questions, by the way, was posed by an inquirer by the name of Nana Liana in a Facebook page. And the Facebook page is called Meanwhile in Malaysia. I read about it in Focus Malaysia, but the Nana asked the question in Meanwhile in Malaysia Facebook page. And she asked, why are non-Muslims in Malaysia supportive of Israel when Israel has committed crime against humanity against the Palestinians in Gaza? And also she also asked, like, why are the non-Muslim in Malaysia seemingly like mocking the suffering of the Palestinians? And to this I would like to offer an explanation. Unlike the administrators of the Meanwhile in Malaysia page who countered Nana by saying, like, hey Nana, maybe you're jumping to conclusion, my friend, that most or all non-Muslims in Malaysia support Israel and do not sympathize with Palestinians. Actually, most of us do not support Israel, and most of us actually sympathize with Palestinians. I would just cut to the chase, get to the point by saying that I actually agree with Nana. I also observe what she has observed, that most non-Muslims in Malaysia, perhaps we are not that supportive of Palestinians, and we are not that against Israel. Now, as to why, there are two reasons, and they are both connected to the concept of identity. Now, to understand why many or most non-Muslims in Malaysia do not support Palestine, or maybe even sympathize with Israel, or that somebody like Nana, means somebody like a Muslim, a Muslim like Nana, can ask herself, what is her opinion about the massacre of the Sri Lankan Tamils in the Sri Lankan Civil War? If she were to ask herself whether she thinks that it was wrong for the Sri Lankan army to massacre the Tamils of Sri Lanka, I believe that her answer would be that she doesn't know enough about the conflict to determine which side is right or which side is wrong. Even if she were to take an interest on the subject, dig deeper, she would still likely take an objective, neutral, or balanced point of view of the conflict, and perhaps come to the conclusion that it isn't obvious to her that the Sri Lankan Tamils were right, or that it isn't obvious to her that the Sri Lankan government and army was wrong, or maybe even believe that the Sri Lankan government and army was perhaps even justified in taking such a harsh measure against the Sri Lankan Tamils. The reason why it is likely that say a Malay Muslim like Nana would take such a neutral, objective, balanced, perhaps even pro-Sri Lankan army point of view is simply because she doesn't identify with the Sri Lankan Tamils. Now, if you ask the Malaysian Tamils about the Sri Lankan Civil War, the answer is quite clear. Most, if not all of us, will say that what happened to the Sri Lankan Tamils is a crime against humanity. It's a genocide, and that the entire world should have done something to stop the injustice, the cruelty, the crime against humanity that the Sri Lankan army was inflicting against the Sri Lankan Tamils. The world, by the way, did not do much or anything to stop the massacre of the Sri Lankan Tamils. As a matter of fact, most of the nations of the world not only stayed silent and indifferent to the sufferings of the Sri Lankan Tamils, many nations, including Malaysia, would label the LTT Liberation Tigers of the Tamil Eelam, which was fighting on the side of the Sri Lankan Tamils, as a terrorist organization. This itself indicates that many nations in the world, including ours, were supportive, perhaps even sympathetic to the point of view of the Sri Lankan government and army, not the massacred Sri Lankan Tamils. In the same way, most non-Muslims in Malaysia are likely indifferent, objective, neutral, have a two-sided point of view, a balanced point of view that can listen to the point of view of the Palestinians, and also listen to the point of view of the Israelis. In the case of the war between the Palestinians and the Israel, for the same reason that most non-Tamils in Malaysia were indifferent, objective, neutral, or even supportive or sympathetic towards the Sri Lankan government in the Sri Lankan Civil War. You see, while many of us tend to believe that truth and justice in this world is an absolute concept, The fact of the matter is, justice and truth in this world actually likely depends on identity, like how to what extent we see ourselves in others. If we identify intimately with someone, as how the Malaysian Tamils identify intimately with the Sri Lankan Tamils, or how the Europeans identify intimately with the Ukrainians, or how the Malay Muslims identify intimately with the Palestinians, their suffering might appear to us as unjust, cruel, a crime against humanity, genocide, while the ones inflicting these injustices and cruelties might seem to us as inhuman, monstrous, even evil. But if we don't identify with them, then this is unlikely the perspective that we will adopt. This is the cold hard truth. Now, secondly, as Samuel Huntington predicted in his seminal work, The Clash of Civilization, in 1996 itself, the world today is on the brink of a civilizational clash. As we can see today, the Chinese civilization is already set against the West. The West is already at war with the Orthodox Christian civilizations in Ukraine. The Chinese and the Indian civilization have also engaged in a border dispute, while the Western civilization, as we can see through US and Israel, is actively at war with the Islamic civilization in the Middle East. In this clash of civilization, the loss of one civilization will be to the benefit or gain of the other civilizations involved. In Malaysia, the Malay Muslims chiefly identify with the Islamic civilization. Indians, the Indian civilization. Chinese, the Chinese civilization. And all of us, Malay, Indian, Chinese, probably also identify with the Western civilization on account of our colonial history. Because of the conflict between the Western civilization and the Islamic world in the Middle East, the Malay Muslims are getting estranged from the Western civilization. The Malay Muslims' relationship with the Western civilization is getting strained. But just because the Malay Muslims' civilization with the West is becoming strained, it doesn't mean that the relationship between the local Chinese and the local Indians with the Western civilization is also equally affected. Actually, to be brutally honest, Israel is actually a part of the Western civilization. Its values, appearance, worldview are that of the Western civilization, which all Malaysians, by virtue of our colonial heritage, identify with. If the Palestinians were not a nation within the Islamic civilization, say Palestine was, it belonged to, say, the Chinese civilization, for example, it might be the case that in their conflict with the Israelis, the Malay Muslims themselves might not only have not taken the sides of the Palestinians, they might even have taken the side of the Israelis, because the Israelis are the one that is closer to the Western civilization, while Malaysians, including the Malays, Malay Muslims, are also quite connected to the Western civilization because of our colonial past. Also, the relationship between the local Chinese and the local Indians with the Islamic civilization cannot be said to be positive. At best, it can be said to be neutral. As a rule, the local Chinese and the local Indians tend to view the Islamic civilization as trying to exclude us. They are not trying to include us, they are trying to exclude us. While the Western civilization is one that we see that is trying to include us. Thus, when a nation from the Islamic civilization like Palestine and one from the Western civilization like Israel are in conflict, the local Chinese and Indian might find it easier to identify with the Israelis simply because we are already inclined to identify with the Western civilization, while at the same time feel that we are excluded from the Islamic civilization. That's I hope that is quite clear. Now, finally, the local Chinese and the local Indians, on account of their intimate identification with the Chinese and Indian civilization, might also subconsciously appreciate the conflict between Israel and Palestine, because by extension, it will probably weaken either the Western civilization or the Islamic civilization or both, which will in turn benefit the civilization that they identify with. So in short, just to cut to the chase, to answer Nana Liana's question, the reason why the non-Muslims and Muslims in Malaysia do not see the war in Gaza in the same light, it is because we have different identities, and also because the world seems to be heading towards a clash of civilization, where the loss and suffering of one civilization that we do not identify with will be seen as being profitable and as a win for the civilization that we do identify with. If you are hoping, before I end this episode, I will end it by saying something positive, perhaps suggesting that we can do something to reduce this unease, suspicion, distress, and frustration that will arise because of the differences in our identity in this age of civilizational conflict. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Not only do I think that there is nothing that we can do to improve the strained state of our racial and religious relationship in these troubled times, I think our strained state of racial and religious relationship within Malaysia will continue to deteriorate into the future. Now, the only thing I can say is that there's a line which goes like this: the truth will set you free. If you know the truth, it will set you free. With that, I think I'm just going to leave you with this cold hard truth that I have laid in front of you. And I hope that it will make you understand our reality better, and this clarity will, to an extent, alleviate your distress, alleviate your difficulties, as the racial relationship in Malaysia continues to be hammered not only by domestic issues but also by trials and tribulations that is being faced by the civilizations of the world in the troubled time ahead. That's all I can say now. And with that, I'm just going to end this episode by saying, as usual, stay safe, have a good day. I hope to see you again in the next episode. Thank you for watching, guys. Bye bye.